You can't deal with something by ignoring it. Americans need a real plan to keep Social Security strong. Hey candidates, answer the call already.
David, you started out as a journalist on the city desk of the Baltimore Sun. The first time I think you had an awareness of the impact of drugs on your city in Baltimore. Since then you've written a book called The Corner, which observed a specific corner in West Baltimore. Later still you wrote a series called Homicide, and of course the award-winning The Wire. It seems like a lot of your professional life has in some way involved an observation on the impact drugs has had on your city, Baltimore, and your country, America.
Yeah, I am in a very drug-saturated city, Baltimore, sort of at the point of the spear when it comes to the drug war, and it was clear that the dystopia of the American drug war was the crime that kept on giving in my city. Other things were sort of singular events. But drug crime and the convolutions that my society was going through over drug prohibition, that was pretty much the main story if you were a police reporter in a Rust Belt American city.
What do we want? When do we want it? No longer can drug laws serve as a stimulus package for prison communities on the back of poor people.
My takeaway from the past 15 years isn't that we need to wait until we get consensus. It's that we need to do what's right. If there are people like this body who are the sentencing experts that are supposed to tell Congress and tell the public what the right thing to do is, I just urge you to do it.
One of the most powerful aspects of the film is the way it identifies how the war on drugs impacts mostly on the most marginalized, the most defenseless, the most vulnerable, otherwise known as the poor.
Poor. Absolutely. In fact, I'm not entirely unconvinced that it is not largely intended as a war on the poor now. I'm not sure that we can distinguish anymore. It may have begun a long time ago as a war on dangerous drugs, but at some point it morphed to the point where it was really about social control. And at this point, it's about doing something with the 15% of my country that we don't need anymore for our economy. We've lost our manufacturing base, and we don't need a laboring class. And so there's a lot of undereducated people who the economy has thrown away and who are living in an alternate America and have no purpose. I mean, there's an existential crisis for the poor. And in a horrible way, I think they've solved it by targeting them.
That's an incredibly bleak outlook, and it suggests a kind of deeper criticism about a market economy which, as you said recently in The Observer, a market economy that doesn't have a social contract. And it feeds into other themes around whether it's the bailing out of the banks, whether it's multinationals that are warehousing
Absolutely.
taxes.
I would not have been one of the people gently eulogizing Margaret Thatcher in your country or Ronald Reagan in mine. I think the last 30, 40 years has been a misapprehension of capitalism as something that it isn't. And I am not ready to throw capitalism out because there is scarcely an alternative. I'm not a Marxist. But I understand, as so many of our leaders I think no longer understand, that capital and profit are not metrics for how you build a just and viable society, and an inclusive society. They're metrics for how much money you can generate, and generate in the short term in some sense, since most of our markets measure things in terms of quarters, and most of our analysts want to see profits now. So they're not even concerned with the long-term health of the industry, let alone society. So you look at what capital has been mistaken for and the range that it's been given to affect our lives, and how little it's been married to any other societal ambition that might exist. It's kind of shocking that we've become so retrograde, but at this point, human beings are worth less every day. Our market-based economy is making sure of that. When capitalism started out, it was fairly unrestrained, and you had things like the Industrial Revolution in your country and the age of the robber barons in mine. And it actually was governance, democratic governance, that looked upon the raw power of capitalism and said, we want to encourage this, but we at some point have to marry it to a social compact. And that, people it wasn't radicals in my country, it was people like Theodore Roosevelt who said, you know what, the monopolization of capital and this level of stratification where 1% of the country controls this much of the resources, this is not healthy for democracy. This is not going to work if we are going to continue to be a republic. So there was a proportionality that was introduced, and ultimately the great manifestation of that was collective bargaining, which has been systematically marginalized and damn near destroyed for the last 30 years. I don't want to see unions and guilds win every fight. I don't want to see capital win every fight, but it's in that tension between the two that my country was able to create a consumer class that was the greatest economic engine the world's ever seen. We took a laboring class that had marginal income, and we turned them into a middle class that could buy not only all the things they needed, but a lot of things that they didn't need, and transform the American economy in a way that, in the last part of the 20th century, that no one's ever seen. And we've been dismantling that for the last 25, 30 years.
You draw a very clear line between how that economy has been dismantled, the hollowing out of manufacturing, the hollowing out of inner cities where industry has taken flight, and it's left behind a group of people who have nothing else to rely on but illegal drugs to make money.
Absolutely. If they didn't catch that wave into the middle class and the upper middle class, if their kids didn't get to college and the grandkids didn't get to grad school, then they are vulnerable, and they are less and less relevant to the American dream. The American dream has become increasingly narrow. And so then you introduce a war on drugs. You create inner city areas where the only viable employer is the drug trade. The factories are all gone. Unemployment among young black males in my city, black males in their 20s and 30s, unemployment is at 50%. That's not an economic model that works anymore. That's not because people don't want to work, people are desperate. It's because there is no work, and there is no, it doesn't exist in these places like West Baltimore or North Philadelphia or East St. Louis. And then you introduce this incredible factory that is always hiring, which is the corner, the drug corner. And you start using morality to suggest that people shouldn't go to work, shouldn't find meaning in the one industry that's left in their world. They should just say no to drugs. Morality is, in some ways, the last refuge of a scoundrel, much like patriotism at this point. One America lecturing the other on morality when they've already distanced themselves from their fellow citizens in that way is a very cynical act.
You are very, very skeptical that political leadership can get us out of what has been a 40-year failed experiment. And in a recent interview with The Observer, you seem to suggest that it's really going to be a different type of movement if we're going to change people's perception and change the kind of fundamental basis of the war on drugs.
I believe in collective action. I believe in collective bargaining by working people. I don't think that is the same banner that was there in 1880 and 1920, it's going to become relevant again if they keep down this path. It has seemed as if unions are passé in an economic sense in this time of great flux and great technological change. But if human beings are marginalized to the point where labor itself and everything on a level from everything from manual labor to or assembly line labor to intellectual property. It's a race to the bottom across the board with capital leading the way, with uninhibited capital leading the way. That matters to me. The other thing that matters to me is dissent. And I believe, as with Prohibition in my country, as with Volstead in the first part of the 20th century, what ended alcohol prohibition in my country was not great political leadership. It was an unwillingness of 12 Americans to sit on a jury and put a 13th in jail for making gin in their bathtub, or for selling gin, or for drinking gin. And ultimately, that is going to be the answer to the drug war. It's going to be jury nullification. And you're already seeing it in places like Baltimore, where they can't get a jury to put another young black man in jail. They don't believe the police, and they don't believe in the result, and they're already walking away with verdict after verdict. Although I don't think it's as intensely political. They're not citing chapter and verse on jury nullification, on the morality of that. They just feel it.
One other suggestion coming out of the States is that what might happen is that the business community in America might see that what the war on drugs effectively does is fences off a very large market which is owned and controlled by drug cartels. And there is a certain number of people in right-wing libertarian circles in America who are saying, we'd like to get our hands on that market.
Right. If
Move
there's
it
cash
from the
involved,
cartelist
right,
to the capitalist.
Right. If there's cash involved, you can always depend on the libertarians and the conservatives. I'm a little cynical about that. Ultimately, I'm not sure you can entirely rationalize the use of hard drugs. I'm not particularly interested in the process by which you would do that. I just want to decriminalize it to the extent that, you know, we're not creating the American gulag. We are the jailingest country on the planet right now. And that is not just in terms of per capita rates of incarceration, but there's actually more Americans in prison than there are Chinese. And they're working with a couple of billion, and we're working with 300 million. This is an illness on our part. We're addicted to this. And ultimately, for as many capitalists or libertarians who say, you know, there's profit in here, and there's venture capitalism that can be done here with this illegal drug market, there are also corresponding capitalists and venture investors who are lobbying, you know, their companies are now lobbying American legislatures for harder drug laws and for harder laws against illegal immigration. And, you know, the for-profit prison industry is one of the most vile creations. Again, you know, the idea that government is not supposed to legislate morality, that we can leave that up to the markets, that's a sickness. That's a socio-apathy that really needs to be addressed, because it hasn't ever happened. You know, if you talk to a libertarian or a conservative, they'll always talk about, well, you know, we're having this crony capitalism now, and that's not right. And if we could just get a purer form of capitalism, it's never happened in the history of man. There is no pure capitalism. You know, the moment you say you're going to be dependent on free markets for your moral outcomes, there's always somebody who's willing to lay in the cut and sell shit for gold. You know, witness the mortgage bubble fiasco. You know, the idea that capitalism is pure, that somehow if we could only get to that pure state of you know, wondrous economic barter where everybody gets what they need, I'm astounded by that. I'm astounded by the juvenility of that.
Final question. There are a lot of critics emerging about the way the market economy appears to be overheating, that the 1% is almost disengaging from the rest of society. People like Robert Reich, an ex-Labour secretary under Clinton,
he's been banging the drum for years.
The Age of Inequality, that documentary which is just about to come out, a powerful criticism of how it's failed the middle class, capitalism. Michael Sandel about the morality of markets. Do you think there is any possibility that a momentum will build in terms of a greater criticism of the kind of overheated market economy that we're currently seeing, and some restraining forces will be brought to bear?
Well, we have certain problems in my country in terms of how the democratic ideal is translated through our government. We have representation problems in terms of the anachronisms of our Constitution, and how the bicameral legislature works, and you know, it doesn't represent our actual population. It certainly doesn't represent the polls on certain issues. We have problems with how you know, there is no, again, another problem. We have never defined a free market system in which capital has not endeavored to purchase the levers of government. That always happens, and you always have to be on guard on that. But basically, you know, with Citizens United in my country, elections are about how much money you can throw on top of the pile. And the idea of one man, one vote is something that is receding in the American culture. But having said that, I actually think that things will have to get worse before they get better, but they will get better at some point when people have just had enough. And at some point, listen, I'm part of the 1%. You know, I made a show for HBO. The checks come in the mail. I'm doing fine. If too many of us believe that democracy is about liberty, but not about some concomitant level of responsibility, then a certain totalitarian aspect, you know, in which power is rooted in money and in wealth, is going to take hold and become entrenched. But I think there are a lot of people who understand that a republic requires as much responsibility as it does liberty. And it's in the tension between those two ideas that a great society is built. And you can't have one, you cannot have a great society without both things. And I think there are a certain number of Americans who are starting to argue that point vociferously now, belatedly.
David Simon, thank you very much.
Thank you.